dear colleagues, I didn't know that we have so many semioticians in Tartu. Because this means that today we have here a seminar on ecology, and eco-critique, which is the seventh and last one in our series of seminars organized by our students, Katre Bern and Katre Valley. They will be the moderators of the seminar today, our doctoral students. And so here we have people of our each grade of semiotics probably. Myself not being the oldest. Yeah. This chance to have the seminar here together with Umberto has many rules, as everything has many rules. But to come closer, we two have met for a little longer 2 times earlier. First was on 2002 in San Marino, when you organized a symposium in honor of Thomas Semiotic. The symposium was called From Clever Hans to Kanzi. And the second time was last August in your country house. I do think that semiotics, in the way as we here in Tartu have, or trying to approach it or understand it, studying from Yuri Lotman and other of our older teachers, and the way now it has been approached and built up in Bologna are in the whole field of semiotics pretty close. There are certainly some differences, and about these and several other probably will ask and discuss during the next hour. But at this moment, I think I would pass the moderating here to Katres.
Firstly, I would start with an issue about how to ask questions. We have an option, if somebody feels uncomfortable asking questions themselves, we could give you some papers, so you could write your question on paper and send it to us. So, just in case, I will distribute and pencils, in case you also don't have a pencil. So.
For the Alcoholic Anonymous.
Exactly.
Let it be also mutual, in the way that you may ask questions from our students.
Well, first you make questions, and then when I have to protect myself, I start with the question with the typical Jesuit methodology to answer a question with another question.
It's not only Jesuit.
And the answer to the statement like that is why. Jesuit, not Dominican.
So, does anyone have a starting question?
Speak up because we don't have
okay, yes. So, today morning you were talking about, I have 2 questions. First is probably a nuisance, and the second is probably something weird. But still, semiotics? This is the first question. The second question is, a sign. Is it something that people use actually in real communication, or is it a theoretical concept to research on communication?
The first question is very easy to answer, because in a way, narrative, it depends when we fix the birth date of semiotics. If we decide to do it in the Greek times, okay, semiotics always existed, and then narratology is a province of semiotics. In another way, narratology existed independently of semiotics. We have books on the art of writing novels in the 17th century, certain researchers. And it is doubtful whether the first Russian formalists, speaking of narratology, were already thinking in a semiotic way or not. Today, I see narratology as a special section of semiotics. It would be very difficult to separate, even though there was people who was making narratological reflections without ignoring semiotics. In the United States, for instance, there was a great tradition of studies on the make of a novel and things like that, but people who ignored the semiotics. But the fact that one ignores the existence of a discipline doesn't mean that this one is outside the control of that discipline. Okay, is the notion of naturaliter Christianus. You can be a Muslim or a Buddhist, but if you behave properly, you are naturaliter Christian, and you will go in paradise. In any case, as for the sign, you know that one of the most embarrassing problems for people interested in semiotics is, what do you mean by sign? Because for certain, sign is the signifying side. But if you go to Peirce, for instance, he calls sign only the signifying side. While for Saussure is the whole of signifier and signify. So, and what is the size of a sign? For certain people still believe that a sign is something like a linguistic unit. But for Peirce, the entire Odyssey is a sign. So everything that stands for something else is a sign. In this sense, you can decide that sign is a purely theoretical construct, or you are really dealing with signs. Suppose you are identifying signs with words. No? Signifiant, signifié, expression, content, and signs are an everyday reality with a material side, which is the expression side. But it depends on the theorists. So it's very embarrassing to answer you. Qu'est-ce que c'est que le signe? Once, to define the absence of signs, I made a joke, half in English and half in French, the lack of seeing, the absence of...
Next question.
Okay, on the future of semiotics.
On the future of semiotics. But I started to speak of the future of semiotics in the past, a long time ago, insisting, and I cannot but repeat his opinion, which is not shared by everybody. Semiotic is not a science. Semiotics is not a discipline. Semiotic is a school, like medicine. medicine you have dietetics, surgery, dentistry, many other activity, practice, theories. What there is in common between dentistry and dietetics, if not the fact that with your teeth you eat so a way to make a good diet to eliminate your teeth, but okay. What do they have in common? They have in common two things. One is the aim, the human health. And so the Hippocratic code. And the second, that there is a sort of package of common principles. A dentist and the dietist can need, for instance, blood exams in order to understand your state of health. And they rely on the same criteria for measuring your blood. So there are some basic ideas and concepts in common, but then there is no relationship between the job of a dietist and the job of a surgeon who opens your body. And I think that semiotics is more or less like that. It is interested with an enormous universe of signification and communication, but what are the connection between Chomskyan syntax and Genet narratology? There is something in common. We have more or less, even though we don't use the same terms, that there is a signified side, but you can spend your life in making narratology by ignoring the Chomskyan syntax. But in spite of that, there are two semiotic kinds of inquiry. Then, apropos of science, I make a very clear division between applied semiotics, special semiotics, and general semiotics. Once I scandalized my friends of the University of Pavia, who were the most important center at that time for the semiotics of literature. They made a sort of anthology, many papers about semiotical or semiological, as they said at the time, criticism. I said there is no semiotic criticism. A critic, in order to understand the text, can use a lot of semiotic instruments, but there were excellent critics from Saint-Beuve to the scientists who made good criticism and analysis of literary work without making semiotics. You can use a lot of semiotic instrument, and maybe not. You can use also, let's say, biographical material. I don't think that Lotman, when he was interested in the life of was Pushkin, was acting semiotically in this moment. I think he thought that it was important also to know the private life of the author. Then there is specialized semiotics. The maximum example is the analysis of the traffic lights made once by Prieto. It is a scientific analysis. He has no so many ways to be increased. What Prieto said about the grammar of traffic lights is what a human being could have said. Stop. It's a complete science. Finished. No, implement a new approach to traffic lights. And then it is a specialized semiotics, the linguistics of Estonian language. Many of those specialized semiotics can have the status of a science, in the sense they can make provisions. In normal situation, an average speaker would say so and so. It's a sort of scientific way to foresee the semiotic behavior. Then there is the general semiotics, which for me is a philosophical approach, a philosophical definition of all the instruments of semiotics, and in the last decades, more and more, is not identify, but assuming many of the problems of so-called cognitive science. Because 30, 40, 50 years ago, for instance, being a linguist or a semiotician and be convinced that there is something called meaning, it was forbidden to think of meaning as a mental reality. You had not to be interested in what happened in the human mind because you don't have microscope to see what happened there, but it was forbidden, absolutely. Then with cognitive science we started to be profoundly interested in what happens in our brain. And many problems of cognitive science are in common with semiotic problems. At least myself, I have been more and more involved in that study. One of my last books, more than 10 years ago, Kant and the Platypus is about problems like that. And I had a colleague of mine say, that's not semiotics. For me, semiotics is social semiotics, to understand what happens in society, publicity, advertising, and things. It's like the quarrel between a dentist and the dietist to decide what medicine is. But that's my position. So semiotics is destined to be more and more fragmented. But this is also a personal experience who everybody has worked in this field. In the early 60s, I knew everything you had to know about the film semiotics. And we had the discussions. Now, I cannot follow everything is published on this field. I rely on young collaborators that work in that direction. I cannot. First, I cannot because there are many other fields, but even though it was the only field, I would surrender. I am too old. So the discipline is proliferating, and that's why, for me, general semiotics is more and more important because it's the way to keep together, at least for a general methodological point of view, all those particular researches.
Well, you said comparing semiotics with medicine has its aim to heal the people.
Yeah.
Say, in this case, you would like to say that semiotics actually is medicine of culture, or what's the aim of semiotics in that case?
Well, okay, it has not to be in the same like medicine a practical aim. It is to understand the universe of signification, not necessarily of communication. Once provocatively I said the semiotics is what explain in which sense we lie. We can say the contrary of truth. But when explaining what is semiotics to a layman, I say, look, and I know that the semiotics can discuss that, a dog following the tracks of an animal, in spite of what Sextus Empiricus said some centuries ago, is interested only in presence, with the present smell. The fact that following the present smell it arrives to the prey, I am not sure that the dog is planning to find the prey. It's following a presence. Human beings are able to speak of dogs, as I'm doing in this moment, even though dogs are not here. Semiotics is interested in them. I can speak of my mother, of good dogs, of God, and of many other things who are not here. And that's it, is the human attitude that characterizes semiotics. And I think that even zoosemiotics author can speak of zoosemiotics as far as the animal behavior approaches this condition to be able to be concerned with what is not here. Bees, for example, not suggest that the bees have been the first to be studied because they are able to communicate. In the early 80s, and there was also Tom Semiotic, but many other people like Varela, the immunologists organized in Lucca in Italy a meeting with semioticians. It was an exciting experience. I have a paper on it in my, I think, the limits of the presentation. Because the immunologists were convinced that the immunological process has a semiotic aspect. I discovered they had read all my books, the books of sympathy. They were interested in explaining in which sense a lymphocyte T do that and that according to a sort of triadic version. And the embarrassing situation was that myself, more than the others, but in any case the semiotician were saying, no, semiotics has nothing to do with your job. Why? The immunologist said, no, we are interested in semiotics. Now, it's very long to explain what I tried to say, but my problem is when the lymphocyte T arrived at that point, has it the possibility of choosing? I do that or I don't do. If it has this space of choice, okay, we are in front of a semiotic event. If not, we are only in front of a stimulus response. But there was also Giorgio Prodi. You probably know his book. I published it first in Italy and then immediately Tom Semiotic wanted to publish it in English. He was a cancerologist, but with a lot of interests in philosophy and human science. And yes, he knew that there is a state of things in which we have only stimulus response. But he tried to isolate the threshold, the moment in which it was, if not actually done, but it was possible to pivot it from the stimulus response to what with the immunologist I call the space C, that was the space of choice. And I think that the discourse started by Prodi was enormously interesting. I published it because it was contradicting what I had written at the end of my theory of semiotics on the lower threshold of semiotics, but I was interested in that. And then, well, okay, Prodi died of cancer, since he was a cancerologist. That was terrible. He knew day by day what happened. And that's your job now to go.
I would like to ask about this. You mentioned that semiotics is not a science and not a discipline, rather a school. So you would say that all these discussions about setting the boundaries of whether semiotics is disciplinary or transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary, I'm asking it because now in our PhD lectures with Tartu we are talking about it very much. So you would say that these discussions are irrelevant?
No, they're irrelevant. They are in process. Semiotics is like Poland. There were moments in history in which Poland didn't exist, moments in which it was like that, moments in which it was like that, then like this. Semiotic. While France more or less from Spain to the Rhine, it was more or less the same, not to speak of Great Britain, it never changed. Poland changed, it was a chewing gum. The semiotics is more chewing gum oriented than stick oriented. It is possible then in the next future there will be other allow a threshold to be trespassed. I don't know, in the same way in which we have seen a lot of items that were not of competence of linguistics to become competence of semiotics from political or legal discourse and so on and so forth. Yes, it is imperialist, as I repeat, but it is not an imperialist science, because it was not a science. Only few naive people like my friend Gray Mass believed it was a science.
But when you teach semioticians, and you do, and you have done it for a long time, then what would be their job? The job for semioticians who is teach. What's that?
But I grew up as a philosopher, and I was always told that we have not to think of a job. A philosopher is pursuing the truth. Then there are philosophers who made a lot of money in their life, and others who died starving. But that's another problem. Is that others went to politics, like Dr. Goebbels. So the problem, once you understand that I am not so sympathetic with some friends that organize meetings for semiotics and marketing and things like that. If you have a good semiotician and want in your life you want to work on marketing, okay, no. Why not? An intelligent, the entrepreneur who decide to use the work of a semiotician. But I don't think we have to teach how to make a good advertisement. We have to teach how to analyze the existing advertisement. It is like those who think that in the university you can teach creative writing. When a young person asks me, what should I do in order to write? My answer is, don't write. There is no discipline that teaches you how to write. If you look at the life of the great poets of writers, they studied, I don't know, engineering or chemistry, engineering, data chemistry, Levi, to mention two great Italian writers. University can teach you how to read, how to analyze texts. Then, if from there you elaborate your personal attitude to creatively write, okay, that's your private affair. So, semiotics doesn't find for job. We are not a, come si chiama, ufficio di collocamento. The office that finds employment. Job office. Job office. Okay. We are not the job office. Otherwise, can you imagine that people used to make abstraction can teach really people how to make a job and how to make? But we would be a disaster.
You are the writer, and not only. And you work with and within the realm of language. So, the question is, do you believe that human beings have anything to do with creating a language? Or
if I believe that
human beings,
we
people, we ever could and probably did create a language? Or is it some system that exists outside and that has been and will be, which was given to us, which we use and modify, but do not create, we never could?
I think this is the typical metaphysical question that shouldn't be discussed in serious places. Do you work this morning? Did you work this morning
No.
Because I was asked once again about the origins of language, and I remember that the Association for Linguistic Studies in 1860 made the decision not to accept papers on the origin of language. it's is not a scientific task, because scientific task must rely on experience and of facts, on evidence. Since language is a flatus vocis, all the evidence about the past language have been lost. In spite of this, there were many researchers saying, yes, okay, but we have evidence in archaic existing languages. That's one of the reasons why linguists go to Vilnius in order to find the remnants of the old Indo-European and so and so. And then now, with the new neuroscience, at least it's possible to try to understand more and more in which way we elaborate and invent language. To answer your question, you have first to decide whether God exists or not.
Yes,
That is
the same question. But I was asking
if God exists, the idea was, first of all, he invented day, so he invented all the languages, including Estonian, and then he gave it to people. If God doesn't exist, you have still a possibility. Even you have in your mind a sort of inner mechanism that makes every human being able to invent the same language. That would be a quasi-Chomskyan possibility, or the Epicurean theory. Every people in every different situation with a different climate, that they invent a different language. The fact that there are, up to now, still 5,000 languages in the world. Many of them disappearing every day, but that's, and probably even in the past that there were, I don't know, 10,000, means that on one side human beings were inventing language, because otherwise every people would have received the same language. So they were inventing language, but they were inventing it in a different way. But it was a language. So probably there is some cerebral structure that allows human beings to invent language.
So some primal person, some smart ape could make up a language and distribute it among people.
Yes, but since we have few chances to talk with an ape and to read what they wrote about God and language, we still believe we have a sort of advantage on that. I don't exclude that mice can speak, but they are unable to tell us something about that. It's like, the aliens are able to travel through the space. Okay, why are not they here?
So you must read Umberto's book, Search for the Perfect Language.
Yes, I spoke about all the theory, because the search for the perfect language was in fact a way to explain, let's say, historically the origins of language. There is an original mother tongue, and from which all the other derive. But the very fact that this debate continues from the times of the Babel Tower, in any case, from the beginning of the first millennium, when immediately after the subdivision of Latin into the different European languages, without having found a reasonable answer, means that the problem risks to be a sort of dog biting his tail and going around without any possibility.
Still, you did not give your own insight on it. You did not share your personal view.
Yes, my personal view was the one expressed by that book, that it is impossible to find a modern language.
I always think that the Estonian language was created after the fall of the Babel Tower, not in the first day.
But they are in any case, they are the so-called nationalistic hypothesis by which, as I saw this morning, the first language, the language of Adam, was Sweden, it was French, it was Flemish, it was, but every people, it was Irish, every people elaborate, no, for every people there was at least a crazy linguist elaborating a theory of the national origin of human language. Then there was all the discourse of the 17th century, Webb, Laperrière, etc., by which they discovered the Chinese chronologies. And they discovered that Chinese chronology were more ancient than the Hebrew chronology. So the word was not born 6,000 years, but 12. So the problem was that when Noah stopped with his ark, probably stopped in China or in another country in which there was a previous language, and so it is kind of a big heretical problem, because even there were other civilizations between the Mediterranean one who committed the original sin, and for whom Jesus Christ came to die in order to save them, but to save only the Palestinians and not the Chinese that were there before. So it was a matter of heresy, of persecution of people like his man Laperrière, who wrote all this story on the Chinese civilization between the original sin of Adam. So he said the original sin of Adam concerned only, today we would say, Middle East and the Mediterranean area.
A similar theory was about the Native Americans. They are not.
Yeah, that when they discovered that, it was another. But for Native America, it was easier. They killed all them, and the problem was nothing.
Well, I would ask.
No, it's not a joke. They didn't kill the Chinese, but they killed all the civilization, Maya, Aztec, because the Chinese were too powerful and commercially advanced, so it was important to establish a relationship with them. Maya, Aztec being without wills, and it was easier to define them as an inferior civilization and to exterminate them. And it was also demonstrated that Chinese ideogram convey ideas, then we are very noble linguistic instruments, while the Aztec pictograms were mere imitation. So they were an inferior language, so it was natural to kill all of that.
You mentioned that semiotics today is more pragmatic than it was during even 70s or 60s, when it was beginning to develop. And it seems that today we still kind of try to find this unified core of semiotics in Persian thinking or in Saussurian. We have these debates. What do you think? Is the theoretical core of semiotics in Persian theory approach or Saussurian? Should we unify them in some way, or should we disregard both of them and start from somewhere else?
I spent, I think, 3/4 of my life in trying to unify the two approaches. And I have a chapter in Kant and the Platypus in which I try to explain in which sense they are submitted to a sort of an indeterminacy principle, but which when you examine one side, you... But obviously I am more and more oriented in the Persian direction. I think that the structural approach is useful for analyzing definite and complete systems, like a language, like a language, or the traffic lights, but not so useful to analyze processes, including our process of knowledge, discovery of new things. And so, well, in a way, it's important to keep in mind the two aspects, really as a sort of principle of indeterminacy holding between them, but personally I think that it's more fruitful to go in the Persian direction.
One of your problems also in quantum platypus is the problem of cognition. How we recognize, how we cognize. Say, this is actually a field which has been approached by many scientists. Say, how would you formulate the importance of semiotic approach to cognition, or what, according to you, semiotics can be standard, what other sciences, what other approaches can?
Well, I have tried in the first chapters of Kant and the Platypus to analyze the sort of cognitive approaches and taking into consideration also an encyclopedical point of view, so to distinguish between a core property that everybody shares, by which myself and zoologists are able to identify a mouse, and then what I call the molar quality by which only the competence of a zoologist work. So I try to do something, and I think that semiotic approach can say something more. But well, I wait that somebody will elaborate those suggestions. Since I have discovered that the most important contribution I have given to semiotics is the one that everybody ignored, and it is the second part of the theory of semiotics, the typology of the modes of silent production. And I have discovered that only now young people is elaborating about that. So 75, 85, 95, 30 years later. So I wait for the next method.
Please don't let color you could only ask questions. For us.
But you know, there are always new techniques, so-called semiotics of culture. In 15 days I will be in Madrid, where my former student, who is now the chair of semiotics at Lausanne, wants me to speak of semiotics of culture. Why? Because he's making researches of semiotics of culture. And what I say is that until yesterday, at least I think so, maybe I know a lot of interesting approaches, but the problem was to see culture as an object for a semiotic analysis. Even there is not honor against the structure of culture. Why? Now, by studying the process of memory and oblivion, we discover that culture is a device for producing a semiotic approach. For instance, one of the main functions of culture is not to be a stock, a reservoir of notion, but a mechanism for selecting and eliminating notions. If culture kept the name of all the participants of the Battle of Waterloo, it would become absolutely crazy. Culture has decided that we have not to be concerned. At the same time, sometimes culture has not decided to destroy this reservoir. Probably they put it into a refrigerator. There is an archive somewhere in which, if possible, one day or another, an historian could retrieve all the names of the participants of the Battle of or not. Another problem, what happened to Calpurnia, the wife of Caesar, the day after the assassinations. Until the end of March, we know that Calpurnia told Caesar, don't go to the Senate because I had a dream. After the death of his husband, she disappeared. I say it's not a fact of feminism, because Clara Schumann became famous after the death of Robert Schumann. Huh? Oh, certainly because she had a love affair with Brahms, but that's another story. So probably there is no document left somewhere. There are not Dead Sea Scrolls telling what happened to Calpurnia. Finished. Calpurnia is eliminated by our cultural knowledge. And happily, because we have to keep track of all the wives and husbands of famous people, so culture is operating and continuing. I think these two is to make semiotics of culture, but culture instead of an object has become a sort of transcendental machine that allows you to make decisions about your progression.
Which means that oblivion, forgetting, that is just important, I think, to study also.
I've written about oblivion. I have arrived to those ideas just for that, because all the mnemotechnics are instrument for remembering, okay? Because they associate a certain image to some of the mnemotechnicians of the Renaissance tried to invent a way for forgetting. So obviously one was name was okay. There are mechanical way. There are chemical way. You get drunk. You forget. There are ablation. They cut away a part of your brain. But there are no voluntary operations in order, because this man Gesualdo was imagining. You had to imagine to be in a big palace room in which every object is associated to an idea, and then you have to imagine you throwing everything out of the windows in order to make this space. It's absolutely stupid. If you imagine that, you remember better and better what you have thrown away. So there is no conscious and voluntary way to forget. No.
But there is.
Eh?
There is. Pretty simple. You should change, radically change the context where you are. And if you are able radically to change the context, you actually can forget.
I don't know if radically can. No, I invented another way. Since it happens then when you make a mistake, let's say about a foreign word, and then finally you discover the right translation, it is not that you remember the right solution. You remember both, your error and your solution, and you never remember which is the error and which is the solution. So a way, in order to forget names, would be to play for a long time in distortions. Instead, fork, cork, pork, sork, gork, but if you go, probably we become unable to say fork, but it is uncertain. And then I write, who helps us to forget? That is the mechanism of culture, is the collective mechanism of culture, not consciously and not for a free day. There was nobody in this world who decided to obliterate Calpurnia. It is not to eliminate Trotsky from the photograph, because just by eliminating Trotsky, everybody remembers that there was Trotsky there. So the censure is not the way to that. But this automatic way to drop Calpurnia, to drop the names of the soldier of Napoleon. And culture helps you not to become what? Funes and memorioso. Otherwise you will get crazy.
I would say that if you reinforce the bigger meaning, the right meaning, the fork, over the other one, and if you build bigger than, let's say, the battle tower, then the shadow of the battle tower will hide the little hut that was before the battle tower, and in the end you won't remember it anymore.
That's possible, but I know a lot of persons that committed suicide because they were unable to forget a love affair. So it's, or they decide to drink desperately. So it means it's not so easy to forget.
But sometimes it's easy. For me, it's very easy. When I try to remember something, I'm pretty sure that I forget.
No, that is the way.
They need to learn to control it.
Not even the Chiodo Schiaccia Chiodo, Chiodo
Clavus
Schiaccia.
Club.
Eh?
Clavus Club. Latino.
No, a nail that eliminated another name, not a new name. So people who says in order to forget my beloved that abandoned me, I find a new partner. It is not that you forget. You don't suffer any longer because you are very happy with a new partner. But you still remember that there was another story before. You don't suffer, but you don't forget, which are two different phenomena. When you
according to Freud, you forget what you suffer.
that's another stuff, but you forget that unconsciously. The unconscious is something very similar to culture. That independently of your will operates some surgical cuts and elimination. If I would find a good metaphor for the culture as a mechanism for memory, the unconscious would be a good, probably metaphorical idea.
First, semiotics, among other things, pays a lot of attention on language. However, there is another field, a specialized field that deals with language. This is linguistics. This is the first question.
It's very similar to
when linguists and semioticians are talking about language, are they talking about the same thing, or are they talking about two different things? This is the first question. And what is the definition of language within semiotics? The second question is, touches upon the...
No, first I answer your first question,
Okay,
and then you make the second one. Otherwise, I make a mess in my... I forget. I forget. Semiotics has started to become an interesting approach when it has been interested not only language. The first definition, the one of Saint Augustine, not of Saussure, Saint Augustine, there is a general science of signs that concern military signals, flags, images, and language. And Saussure said the same. So the answer is linguistics, as the analysis of a given language, is one of the specialized semiotics of which I was talking before. So one of the sub-departments of your semiotical departments. Then general linguistics is another, it's more similar to general semiotics, but concerning only language. And general semiotics is interested to see if there are elements and features in common between verbal language and other systems. In a way, the beginning of modern semiotics in the 60s was characterized by an exaggeration in finding features in common between human language and other way of communication. For instance, I am responsible for a very stupid theory which has been very successful and translated in every language, as it happens always when something is stupid. Fighting for a third articulation in cinema. but why cinema should have articulation like verbal language? But at that moment we were obsessed by the beautiful idea of the double articulation of language, and we wanted to find articulation and something similar to phonemes, even so people who work in architecture trying to find the brick-ins, while probably the whole architectural system had to be approached in another way. But in those exaggerations, there was something very useful in trying to speak from a unified point of view of so different systems. So simply linguistics, and more than that, the specialized linguistics of a given language are one of the most elaborated and the most scientific semiotic approaches for very, very clear reasons that it is older, and language occupies such a position in our life that we have studied more and more, and the language has precise rules and so forth. But semiotics tries to go outside. The notion of sign, we were discussing before, has been elaborated in semiotics just in order to find something that makes a linguistic word similar to an image or to a sound, they are sign from a unified general point of view. Second question.
How would you react on those claims of some people who are reading a lot of Christ and Serve, for example?
What reading?
Paul Christ and this American philosopher Serve.
So.
Yeah. To say that semiotics is fine, semiotics is great. There is something missing from the picture, and this is well, there are, well, according to them, a lot of things missing from semiotics. But one of the most important of those is the notion of intention, and in a way it's true because not in the works of, as far as I know, not in the works of Peirce, neither Saussure there is any model or any reference to the interaction between intention and science.
Okay.
Contemporary biosemiotics fast.
It is not totally correct. Obviously, Saussure was interested in structures, not in processes. He was not interested in the way in which we see the world or we use the words. He was interested in language as a structured object that could exist even though we didn't exist. The laws of English are there, defined once and forever, even for aliens, when they arrive at the mankind that doesn't exist any longer. So he was not interested in those cognitive approaches. Peirce was, certainly, he didn't use it in intention and intentionality, at least not in Husserlian sense, because he was people before. Even though he wrote so many things that probably some allusion to the intentionality in the scholastic sense, well, it's possible to find. But when he speaks of the immediate object, which is not the dynamical object that produces the sign, and it is the first representation of the sign in a quasi-human mind, he speaks of a way of directing our attention intentionally to an intentional object, which is the immediate object. So I think, and maybe it has already been done, simply, I don't know it, but it is possible to reread from a Husserlian point of view the theory of Peirce. If not, okay, he was not interested in intentionality, but the problem still exists. When this morning I spoke of our way to speak of fictional characters, and that's the problem of intentionality, of fixing an object of attention and of thought. exist, but was an object for your mind. You can deal with the problem with fictional characters from the phenomenological point of view, I think.
I have a question. You're teaching in Bologna University, and when the students come in your classes, they start from the beginning, not like the ones who go to, let's say, mathematics or chemistry. They have had, those people have had the basic courses in the high school. The culture as such would benefit if the semiotics would be included in the high school curriculum.
I think so. Indirectly, it has been done. In the last decade, it was insisted on the fact that in the school, people would have been taught how to read newspapers and to compare different newspapers, the ways they read the same piece of news, which is a sort of semiotic approach. Then certainly there are certain greater teachers doing that. Probably one of the inconveniences that, as I said, the kingdom of semiotics is so big that it's difficult to define which are the elementary notions to be taught in a lyceum. But it would be possible. There are certain handbooks that at least teach the principle. Now the problem is the decrease of the high school. The new young people arriving at the university, they don't know anything. I don't know here. I don't know here. My time in lyceum, in high school, was teaching everything. Many course of philosophy. Now, for instance, at least in Italy, you can go in the department of communication coming from commercial studies. Without Latin, without Greek, without philosophy, that's tragedy. It's tragic. I think that before reforming the university, we should try to reform the high school. But you see, the trend, America is the lowest level. The American high school is a disaster. And I think that I know friends who are Jewish atheists and they send their sons to the nuns school, to a Catholic school, because in that school they make Latin a little better, they teach something about history, and they pay a lot of money. Otherwise, in high school they simply kill each other with history and
The relationship between semiotics and philosophy, half a year ago, talk together, you made a pretty nice claim that on one hand the whole philosophy will be later covered by something like that, by semiotics in a way, but at least that analytic philosophy will make a suicide. Do you still think so?
Yes, more or less. I think that semiotics is probably the best way to make philosophy today. All the rest is the loss of time. Analytic philosophy will collapse. It is collapsing after Rorty, because they were working more and more in order to look scientific on a reduced syllabus. Every person was obliged to know those 5 or 6 fundamental papers and nothing else, so that they didn't pay attention all to the development of semiotics, linguistics, and so they become more and more provincial, and they are destined to disappear. Then you can discover those that among analytic philosophers like Wilde or Putnam, they say something more. They were not only established or following the analytical syllabus.
Mr. Speaking about high school and field semiotics that you mentioned, it's a very interesting subject for me personally, but it might be for everyone. High school is really a forge where personalities made, sometimes we can do bigger things than we do really. And cinematography, movie, cinema, is, in my mind, a perfect subject to present some simple things, some simple truths, speaking in philosophical terms. And in this way, I would like to know which movies were the most gratifying for you as a semiotic viewer, and would you recommend them for giving in high school?
But you asked me about every kind of movie, from the Lumiere up to now.
Probably. The first question is, what movies did you find most interesting, most challenging for you as a researcher?
Stagecoach.
Stagecoach?
John Ford.
Oh.
It's the movie I would use in order to explain Aristotle's Poetics.
Oh.
He perfectly follows all the rules of Aristotle's Poetics. And it is a great movie. Then another great movie, by mistake, is Casablanca.
Why by mistake?
Because they had no intention to make a masterpiece. They were looking for money. You know that Ingrid Bergman looks so ambiguous that you don't recognize if she loves one or the other, because she didn't know. Until the last moment they were changing the scenario. So she did the script. She didn't know who she had to love. That's produced this marvelous image of a tortured woman that she simply didn't know. Now I am joking because Casablanca is a sort of natural phenomenon like the Great Canyon. It happened to be like that by accident. You know who was conceived to be the protagonist before they chose Humphrey Bogart. They were on the verge of signing the contract with another person. That I don't know why this final moment or he said no, Ronald Reagan. So that tells you what they had in mind when preparing Casablanca.
Maybe Humphrey Bogart is a book matter.
And do you have any ready suggestions for school program, high school program? If you were a teacher at high school and you were to start a movie class, you know, it's a dream thing, and so what would you start with?
I have no suggestion because first of all, I want to see the class. If I don't know with whom I am interacting, what they know, what they don't know, I cannot make a choice. And I cannot establish which kind of approach. Education is not an abstract science. It is like to make love.
But if you would have the same people that are here today, what would you teach them?
They are too smart, they don't need my suggestions.
Next question.
Is language a necessary condition for human culture? Is language the primary modeling system?
Yes, okay. Without any shade of doubt. Yes. And there's an idea that in Tartu you know very well.
You discussed Saussurean semiotics and Peircean semiotics, and you preferred Peircean semiotics, you said before. So what I want to ask is about semiotic threshold. It seems to me that in Peircean tradition you can put it in much lower, if you can put it at all. So have your views changed compared to theory of semiotics? Or maybe you can comment that. So semiotic threshold and Peircean approach.
Well, it is what I have just said about the process of Brody, my discussion with the immunologist and so on. When I put in the theory of semiotics those two thresholds, it was not a really theoretical decision. It was only the confession that I was unable to deal with that and with that. Okay. It was the time in which Julia Kristeva tried to make a psychoanalytical approaches to semiotics. I simply said, I am unable to propose you instrument for that territory, This is my methodological proposal. So it means that I didn't exclude those two territories as by saying no, they have nothing to do with semiotics. They had nothing to do with me at that moment. So I am open to a lot of.
Umberto, what would you say to Tom Semiotic's claim that the idea of language as a primary modeling system was based on a confusion between linguistic communication and language, and that the actual primary modeling system is not language in that sense, but is rather the biologically undetermined, biologically underdetermined, indeveloped species specific to the human animal? So that therefore the languages were Buddhist is actually a secondary modeling system, and culture the tertiary. That was Semiotic's view.
You know, I understand the idea that language is the primary modeling system and they are secondary. I find more difficult to understand that idea. It is true that we give form to the... If you simply say it's not a language but the linguistic activity, okay, no problem. It will be discussed what Lord MacDonald meant by saying primary modeling system. That they said, if they said it is a given language, is English a given primary modeling system, or is the human activity to produce language that it is the primary system? And we can discuss about that. But the fact that we are interpreting the world and making science and doing everything primarily through our linguistic abstractions is so evident. I don't see people interpreting the world without language, with gestural systems or visual systems. You can do something, but not everything. We are mainly linguistic animals.
Can I add one comment about the primary and secondary? I discussed with Tom Semiotic this matter, and I think it's misunderstanding, because for Yuri Lotman, it's primary and secondary. It's absolutely different from, for example, from the first, absolutely first, the second, and third. It's pure relation. He's interested about the secondary system, and regarding to literature, language is primary. But maybe he never said that the language is absolutely primary system. Of course, he agrees with Benveni's point of view and the logical point of view that natural language is not called unary language. Universal language, all other language we can, not all, but the great number of other languages we can translate into natural language. Only this.
But then, to be the primary system doesn't mean that it is omni-effable. Somebody said language can say everything. No, yes. You cannot say by language what happens in the third movement of Beethoven Fifth. And in the same way in which you cannot say by images what happens in the first chapter of the Critique of Reiner Vernunft. So there are things that you cannot say with language, certainly, but they are less than those you cannot say with other systems. That's all. That's all. So it's the most flexible system, not the omni-effable system, as somebody said. In a world without images, it's very difficult to describe linguistically what a circle is.
Is that? I will say that there will be no time for private questions afterwards, so use your chance now.
Okay, Mr. May I ask one more? There's no one else to ask. Still good time? I will. Okay, you're a writer. do you take it easily when you are called a writer? I know you are many things. Okay.
Okay.
So when you're writing, of course, you faced challenges in your life when you knew you were inferior to someone else, to some other person who lived or before or lives alongside. And you wanted to write something that was a bit similar, but would naturally be a bit inferior in a way. Probably you felt sometimes things like that. Did that ever stop you? Or how do you deal with challenges like that when you want to do something that is probably done, that has been done by someone else, in a better way than you might?
The key for success is the sense of insecurity. Only if you continuously suspect to be an idiot, you can produce something interesting. If you fail to be a genius, you are lost forever.
Sure. Okay. But if you feel an idiot, not you, but well, if a writer feels an idiot, sometimes he stops. Sometimes insecurity means
Stop.
you stop.
Although there are many things that I have stopped because I was so insecure that I believed that it was inconvenient to go. But it was just that insecurity to help me to start something else.
You just double your efforts.
Yes, no, insecurity is fundamental. If you trust yourself completely, you become totally incapable of creating something.
True, but when you are insecure, you have to overcome it. How do you overcome your insecurity?
By playing flute.
Being semiotician, you also are a theorist of culture. And now, what about your view as a, well, let's assume you would be a futurist, saying something about culture's destiny, not in the next decades, further on, yeah. What's your expectations?
I never do this job.
Never? No. Why?
Because it's not serious.
Good.
I can be afraid that something happens. Okay? Since I am now a grandfather, I am afraid of the shortage of water because of my grandchildren now. Too. I can be afraid of that, but I cannot tell you what will happen. It's not serious. We can make a forecast only on the short distance. I do not take the car today because probably it will rain. But not forecasts about 3 months.
So, which means this is a pretty general statement now you are making about futurism as science.
Futurism is it means futurology.
Futurology, sorry. Futurology.
It's a way to make money, yes.
Yeah. Right. Futurology.
No, there are honest way of when an ecologist say if you continue to do that, you risk. That is an interesting way of making forecasts. But it's not a forecast. It's an analysis of the present situation. The production men are making a hole in the ozone, and then probably it will tomorrow, but it is already there. So it is based on a scientific observation of today. So we can make a forecast on the possibility that. Okay.
Just one more question.
One more question.
Yeah, because as we are in Tartu right now, I'd like to ask your opinion about, well, you have cited a lot of works of Tartu Moscow School of Semiotics, Lotman and others. What do you think still is the place of this Tartu Moscow School, or even the current Tartu School in contemporary semiotics?
But the contribution has been so many that, you know, on certain semiotic school, Tartu had an influence of certain other. It didn't. I'm unable to say. I simply know that in Italy at a certain moment there was an enormous interest in those things, and it happened in another way in France, and so it arrived very, very late in the Anglo-Saxon country, if it were not because of Hans Schumann or somebody else. So, you know, I'm not sure in this moment how much in Brazil is, but considering that, okay, it was a small center in the world, very isolated at that time, the influence was really, really an interesting one, because it was so difficult at that time to finish. I tell you what happened when I wanted to invite Latman and we said at the time Sovietician, because they were Russian, starting that for the first International Congress of '74. I was told that probably they wouldn't leave them to get out, and they would send, on the contrary, some people very, very officially oriented that didn't disturb the Soviet government. But I had the occasion of becoming on good terms during my first trip to Soviet Union in '71 with the secretary of the Writers' Academy, and then when he was moved to a higher position, he became ambassador in China and so on and so forth. I don't remember the name. So, while on the contrary, the president of the Scientific Academy was a very strong person, difficult to convince. So I had this former secretary of writers at my, come si chiamava? No, vabbè. È venuto con Brightburg, Georg Brightburg, portato, ma lui, okay, the name doesn't matter. Let's suppose it.
Was he a bureaucratic person or a...
Yes, era stato segretario del Spisati Soyuz, poi ambasciatore in Cina, con un nome che finiva in Enco.
We were guessing.
Okay, let's say that it was Ivan. So he was in good term, and they said, listen, what do you think of the president of the academy? He said, he's a son of a bitch. Okay. I suppose that he wanted to send me, let's say, 10 good secretaries, on which Lotman, but he would send me only idiots. So let's make it a deal. 3 idiots and 7 good persons. No. I can try 7 idiots and 3 good persons. No, look, let's make 5 idiots and 5 good persons. So I tried that. Then we got 3 idiots. A lot of them didn't come. 3 idiots. And since when we received the representative of different, that was officially invited, we gave them the hotel and some pocket money. I told to the 3, we have no hotel and pocket money for you. And they said, we know. We have been informed that we are not the right people. And so we pay you for our second. And so, well, then we tried to help them because they were so destroyed.
Because they were smart enough to tell you this, so
yeah,
they
were
gave their
smart
pocket
enough.
money with this.
That's what the 3 idiots. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.